Hello, my name is Garland Nixon. I'm here with Diane Sare and Scott Ritter, and we're going to talk about the START Treaty. As many of you probably know, the last of the very important nuclear proliferation treaties, the START Treaty, here has fallen apart, has expired here within the last 24 to 48 hours. And fortunately, there are some negotiations going on between the Americans and the Russians about this. But certainly, this should not have happened. It's very dangerous, and it is a threat to mankind. Today, we're going to talk with presidential candidate Diane Sare. Diane has declared her intention to run for president in 2028, and she is going to talk about what her plans would be and how she would address this issue and ensure that it doesn't happen again. Thank you very much. We've got a tremendous panel today. We've got Diane, myself, and of course, Scott Ritter. And afterwards, we will open the press conference up for questions. Scott Ritter. In fact, he is an advisor to Diane on arms control and on U.S.-Russia relations. Scott has a storied history when it comes to the issue of arms control. He was a UN weapons inspector, and many of you probably know him from numerous books, including Highway to Hell, in which he talked about and discussed the issues that could arise if these treaties were to fall aside as they have. Thank you very much, Scott. Well, let's start off with Scott Ritter. Scott.
Well, thank you very much, Garland, and thank you, Diane, for inviting me to appear here with you today. I don't know if Diane needs advice, but I'm a sounding board for Diane to talk about the issues of the day. And today, unfortunately, the issue is the expiration of the last remaining strategic arms control agreement between the United States and Russia. This marks the end of 54 years of a legacy of arms control. And people need to understand that the importance of the continuity here, that arms control just doesn't happen in a vacuum. The treaty that expired today has its roots in the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty of 1972. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty created the conditions under which the United States and then the Soviet Union could talk about limiting the size of their strategic nuclear arsenals and then eventually reducing them. If we didn't have the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, both sides would be building ballistic missile defenses that would require additional offensive capability to overcome, and you just get a circle of proliferation that becomes unsustainable and extremely dangerous. That's why the United States and Soviet Union agreed to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 1972. And from that, we were able to begin discussions on first limiting the size of our strategic arsenals. There was at a time when there were 30,000 strategic nuclear weapons on each side. Today, with the New START Treaty, well, I should say yesterday, with the New START Treaty, we were capped at 1,550 each. So it's a significant reduction. But this didn't, again, happen in a vacuum. It required lengthy negotiations, both sides getting to know one another, and beginning in 1988, implementing on-site inspection. I'm very proud to say that I was the first weapons inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And I helped write the book on on-site inspection. On-site inspection is a critical component of any compliance verification mechanism dealing with treaties. But again, it just doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires negotiations. Rules have to be set out. Limits have to be defined by a treaty. The importance of this, just so people understand, in 2009, the original START Treaty, which was signed in July of 1991 between George Herbert Walker Bush and then Russian President or Soviet Union President Mikhail Gorbachev, it expired in 2009. And this is what led to the negotiation of the New START Treaty. And there was concern on the part of the United States Senate about a gap in compliance verification. This is, again, how important it is to have these treaties. The Senate was comfortable with the Russian nuclear forces, strategic nuclear forces, because they were familiar with it because of the reports prepared by the inspectors. They knew how many Russian weapons they were, where they were, what kinds they were, and what the Russians were up to, generally speaking. And the opposite was true. The Russians were comfortable with the American strategic nuclear forces because they had inspectors doing the same work. Senator Lugar, who is the influential chair of the Senate Armed Forces Committee at the time, warned President Obama that if you have too much of a gap between the expiration of START and getting your New START treaty ratified, we will lose that confidence. And once we lose that confidence, we aren't going to be so inclined to sign on to a treaty because we won't have confidence in the numbers. Well, look what just happened today. The New START treaty has expired. It's done. It's finished. There's nothing left. Yes, as Garland said, there's some talk in Dubai between American negotiators and Russian negotiators about a potential 6-month extension. But let's be frank, even though the New START treaty expired yesterday, there hasn't been inspections related to the New START treaty since 2022. That's when the United States and Europe banned Russian aircraft from being able to leave Russia and come to the United States to bring the inspectors in. They were denied permission to fly through the airspace because of European sanctions. And the Russians said, okay, the reciprocal will be true, no American inspectors. So there's been no inspectors doing their job since 2022. That's 4 years. Now, since 2023, there's no data exchange. That means we have a huge gap. One of the things that I've been articulating for prior to the expiration was to get a rebaselining of the New START treaty, having inspectors go back and do the work. But Donald Trump wasn't willing to do that either. So even though we have people talking today, we have a 4-year data gap that's going to be almost impossible to bridge, which means we're starting from scratch. And we're starting from scratch at a time when the United States appears to be on the cusp of increasing the size of our strategic nuclear arsenal. That was the whole reason for us allowing New START to expire, so that we could build more nuclear weapons or deploy more nuclear weapons to counter a perceived Chinese threat. Now, Donald Trump is talking about a grand bargain, but a grand bargain doesn't happen overnight. The complexity of trying to do a trilateral agreement and understanding if you're going to bring the Chinese into the mix, you got to bring the French and British into the mix, and they haven't even been approached yet. This is pie in the sky stuff. And who trusts the United States anymore? Nobody wants a deal. A deal can be broken. A treaty is binding. We need a treaty, but we no longer have people capable of negotiating this treaty. Nobody trusts American negotiators. We are literally in a vacuum, a deficit of trust at a time when we need arms control more than ever. I want to remind people that in 2024, the CIA briefed the United States Congress that there was a better than 51% chance that there could be a nuclear war between the United States and Russia in 2024. At the Cuban Missile Crisis, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy and his advisors believed that the 30 to 40% chance. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis, which has been called the most dangerous period in the nuclear era. In November 2024, the CIA said better than 50% chance. That's the world we live in today. And worse off, at that time, the Biden administration said they're ready to fight a nuclear war. The insanity is real, and we no longer have a treaty to control the insanity, to contain the insanity. What we need is leadership that has a vision of arms control, that believes in real arms control, not a deal, but the hard work of sitting down and making the world safer. And I believe that leader is Diane Sare. So Diane, I'd like to pass it off to you, and thank you again for allowing me to speak.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. And I do really appreciate your expertise. I certainly have not been on the ground in Votkinsk. And if I went there, I would be more interested in the birthplace of Tchaikovsky than the missiles. So I depend on your background, and I appreciate you sharing that with people. And Garland, thank you very much for stepping up to moderate today. So we've heard, as both of you mentioned, that they're talking about, and they even said in the press, informal extension of New START. And that doesn't even begin until the day after it expires. So frankly, this is rather insulting. It is not serious, and it's far from adequate. The reason this is important is that in August of 1945, not one, but 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. Dropping these bombs did not save 1 million American lives, because the Emperor of Japan was already in the process of negotiating the terms of surrender through the Vatican and the OSS. Dropping those bombs had nothing to do with the end of the war. When General Douglas MacArthur received the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri on the 2nd of September, he delivered a very important radio address that I'm going to share a little bit of today because I think it's urgent today to consider where we are. He said, "A new era is upon us. Even the lesson of victory itself brings with it profound concern, both for our future security and the survival of civilization. The destructiveness of the war potential through progressive advances in scientific discovery has in fact now reached a point which revises the traditional concept of war. Men, since the beginning of time, have sought peace. Various methods through the ages have been attempted to devise an international process to prevent or settle disputes among nations. From the very start, workable methods were found insofar as individual citizens were concerned, but the mechanics of an instrumentality of larger international scope have never been successful. Military alliances, balances of power, leagues of nations, all in turn failed, leaving the only path to be by way of the crucible of war. The utter destructiveness of war now blots out this alternative. We have had our last chance. If we do not devise some greater and more equitable system, Armageddon will be at our door. The problem basically is theological and involves a spiritual recrudescence and improvement of human character that will synchronize with our almost matchless advance in science, art, literature, and all material and cultural developments of the past 2,000 years. It must be of the spirit if we are to save the flesh. So, in other words, General MacArthur believed in 1945 that scientific advancement, the destructive potential, had far outpaced the development of the human character and human morality, and that the only hope for survival would be what he called a spiritual recrudescence. After hearing the content of even a tiny fraction of the Epstein files, every American should ask themselves, has that gap between our moral character and our scientific prowess not only widened, but is it now an unbridgeable chasm too deep and too wide to cross? Are we, like Sodom and Gomorrah, doomed? We must now take actions that are radically different from the degenerate path that we've been on since the death of President John F. Kennedy, who managed to peacefully resolve the Cuban Missiles Crisis through intense negotiation with his Soviet counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev. We lack such leadership today. In fact, our so-called leadership seems to be largely held together through disgusting and depraved corruption, which is why I'm running for president. This lack of moral constitutional leadership in the United States puts the world in grave danger. Therefore, even if President Trump simply does what should have been obvious months ago and accedes to Putin's, or accepts, I should say, belatedly Putin's proposal that the terms of New START be extended for 6 months or some period of time, some people might say that's better than nothing. I say this is not adequate given the strategic crisis. Therefore, I offer the following 3-part proposal. The President of the United States must announce a new nuclear weapons doctrine, no first use. This needs to be put in writing and signed by the President and Secretary of Defense as official policy. Every nation with nuclear weapons must do the same. This is already the policy of China. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Pakistan, India, Russia, North Korea, and Israel must do likewise. No double standards. Russian officials have already stated that Russia will not plunge into a wasteful nuclear arms race, but they are already developing new capabilities, as we've seen with the Orezhnik missile, against which NATO, for the time being, has no defense. Russia is prepared for every possibility and will respond proportionately, they say. However, with the recent kidnapping of Venezuela's President Maduro, the bombing of Iran last June, and perhaps impending more bombing of Iran, we don't know, and President Trump's remarks that he doesn't worry about international law because he is guided by his own supposed morality, it is likely that without a drastic change in American military strategy, many more nations are going to develop their own nuclear weapons for their own protection. And the danger to us all will increase by orders of magnitude, which brings me to point number 2. We need a new international security and development architecture. The current organizations are defunct. They don't work. NATO is a joke. This will also include reforming the United Nations to reflect the reality of the influence of the global South, which is now the global majority. But it is not limited to the United Nations. There must be a new order that respects the principles of peaceful coexistence, the sovereignty of each and every nation, and upholds the dignity of man. The United States, on the 250th of our anniversary of our independence from the British Empire, must choose to revive our original anti-colonial intention and stop trying to replicate the very system of oppression against which we fought. Finally, after more than 50 years, the United States is about to send human beings into lunar orbit, which hopefully will inspire Americans to look upward once again. The United States and Russia should embark on 2 major endeavors, both of which will be of great benefit to the people of our respective nations and also to mankind as a whole. The first is to finally begin construction of the Bering Strait tunnel, linking Alaska to Siberia, and thus opening an entirely new corridor of trade and development between North America, Russia, North America, and the entire Eurasian landmass. And secondly, we should take up the proposal made by former Roscosmos chief Dmitry Rogozin, who was the Russian ambassador to NATO in 2011 when he proposed the strategic defense of Earth. His call was an echo of Lyndon LaRouche's 1979 beam defense proposal, which was to have been a joint science driver project of the United States and the Soviet Union, aimed at eliminating the MAD doctrine by making nuclear missiles obsolete. Why should we defend the Earth? 65 million years ago, before the time of any of us on this panel, I will add, a very large object from somewhere in space came hurtling into our planet with such speed that massive fireballs would have incinerated half the hemisphere or more, and then spewed so much ash that the climate was thoroughly disrupted and over 70% of all species on this planet went extinct, dinosaurs being just the biggest. We are currently aware of only a tiny percentage of the asteroids and comets that could impact the Earth with enough force to destroy a city, a nation, or a continent. People might remember Chelyabinsk in 2013. Luckily, that object was not completely enormous, but it did injure about 1,000 people. Shouldn't we do something about this? The United States and Russia have had good collaboration in space. Why jeopardize that now with idiocy? Russia and the United States could partner to launch a crash program to identify those faraway objects which could harm us in the future, and to develop new technologies based on discoveries of new physical principles that would allow us to bump a menacing asteroid or comet just a bit off its trajectory and prevent it from impacting the Earth. The world would be grateful. Is there anyone in Washington who wishes to redeem the soul of our nation and start by taking the threat of nuclear war off the table? Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And just for some information for our audience, over the next decade, the cost for the nuclear weapons program and upgrades, operation and sustainment of nuclear forces, $357 billion, modernization of strategic and tactical systems, $309 billion, upgrading nuclear weapons laboratories, $72 billion, command, control, and communication systems, $79 billion, additional potential costs, $129 billion. So that's over $1 trillion. So not only will we be dealing with the potential destruction of humankind, but if we are fortunate enough to be alive, we'll be spending the money that we could be using for health, for education, and for the betterment and the general welfare of the people of the United States and helping the world, period, as opposed to killing everyone. Now, at this time, if anyone has it, is there anyone that has any questions that need to be answered? Doesn't appear at this point we have any questions, I believe. Oh, okay. If anyone has questions, feel free to bring them up. We go further. So Diane, that's another very important issue I think that needs to be taken into account, and that is the issue of cost. I mean, certainly, the discussion is about the potential destruction of humankind, but if we're fortunate enough to survive, and I believe that with your plan, we could certainly be fortunate enough to survive. The other issue is that all of this money that we waste that could be used on so many other things, that instead of being used to destroy humankind, to endanger humankind, that we could use them, all of the things that we say we don't have money from.
Sure. Shall I answer that?
Absolutely.
There may be some questions. This brings up a draft legislation that some of my colleagues at Executive Intelligence Review wrote, a Swords to Plowshares Act. And in fact, I only learned recently, I mean, you heard what Scott said at the beginning, that there used to be 30,000 nuclear warheads on each side prior to the start, and to the new start, I guess. We have not had a need to mine for uranium fuel for a few decades because of the START agreement, because they were able to repurpose these warheads for the nuclear power industry. And now they're talking about the need to mine uranium again. There's a lot of waste that can be reprocessed as well. But that's a perfect example. That is, we have these capabilities. We have talented people. We have engineers. We have others. We have young people who would like to do something productive with their lives, not produce weapons of mass destruction. And you could say, in a sense, it's the best of all possible worlds, because the United States infrastructure is in horrible shape. Our energy grid is not secure. Our transportation grid is in a shambles. We have no water management to speak of. All of these things have urgent need of investment, and the military industrial corporations, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, et cetera, could be retooled to build what we need. And I think that would be much more productive and would make the American people much happier and more prosperous.
We have Mike Billington with EIR who's raised his hand. If we could bring Mike Billington. Mike Billington.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Garland. And thank you, Diane. Diane, you already brought up the question of the Bering Strait. That certainly is one issue which can address what Garland brought up about how we could spend that money more wisely. It's worth mentioning here that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, just today, or perhaps yesterday, in a press conference he gave with RT, said explicitly that Russia is ready to collaborate with the United States on what he called a wide range of projects, based, of course, on having mutually respectful attitudes towards each other. This brings up something that you know well, which is that Kirill Dmitriev, who is the head of Russia's Russia Direct Investment Fund, but has also been functioning as the representative of Russia in the discussions with the Trump administration over solving the war problem in Ukraine. But Dmitriev earlier, even before the Alaska meeting, brought up the question of the Bering Strait tunnel. He described that as a dream which had been around for over 100 years, that it was an enduring vision of bringing the United States and Russia together, connected by railroad through the Bering Strait, and not only connecting Russia and the United States, but actually connecting the North and South America with Asia and with Eurasia, going into Russia, then into China, into Europe, and even down into Africa. Therefore, creating a total, literally wrapping the world in iron. And this is a policy which is of great mutual benefit to both sides. So you may want to say a few more words about how we can get there and make that the basis for bringing about a resolution of the still difficult but ongoing discussions between the U.S. and the Russian side.
Okay, well, thank you. And sure. And I also want to actually kind of warn, because Scott mentioned something which I think is very important, which is the difference between a deal, which we hear a lot from this leftover Roy Cohn New York real estate legacy, where people are just trying to make money by getting their hands on raw materials or rare earths or something like that, and the conception, which actually is an American system conception, of something that is transformative for mankind. And I will say that the Chinese, I think, studied things like Abraham Lincoln and the Transcontinental Railroad, because if you look at the way China has very rapidly eradicated extreme poverty, a huge part of that was a massive, modern, high-speed transportation network. Because if you want to trade, if you want to have human exchange, if you want to ensure that people have a high standard of living, then you need to be able to move actual physical goods and human beings from one location to the other. So I would ask people to do a thought experiment and consider right now, when you think of how the United States relates to the rest of the world or our foreign policy, everything is oriented toward Europe. And Europe is dead. They drank the Kool-Aid. They did the same Green New Deal, cultural degeneracy, new dark age, rock, drug, sex, shut down all their factories. Biden announced that Nord Stream would be over, and the then German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said, yes, we do everything together, and they all went along with it. Why would we orient towards something which is dead when, if we open up this corridor, we can orient toward a region where you have the most rapid growth on the planet, namely what China's doing with the Belt and Road, the incredible rebound that Putin brought into Russia after the devastating effects of the so-called shock therapy. I think it would change the way that Americans relate to the rest of the world almost instantaneously. We wouldn't have to wait for the railroad to be built. Just the thought of opening that up, imagining that you could go from New York not only to Paris by train, but you could go from New York to Japan by train, or ultimately to the tip of South Africa. And that's the kind of thing that raises the standard of living of the planet as a whole. And it forces the issue, because you're not just going to build a Bering Strait tunnel and then not connect Alaska to the rest of the United States. One thing that Trump did manage to accomplish in his first term was to eliminate some of the restrictions barring rail corridors passing through Canada. So why don't we take advantage of that and actually build this? That's a very different perspective than the short-sighted deal making that seems to dominate most of our what we call diplomacy, which really isn't.
We've got three people raising their hands. We're going to start with Catherine Waters. Catherine, what's your question for Diane?
Thank you for having this talk. I'm just, trying to figure out, like, how do we not have taxes keep going to warmongers and to go to, what it should be going to? Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Diane?
Elect me.
There
the
we go.
easy answer. And elect my friend Jose Vega. We're going to have to fight. We're going to have to organize. We're going to have to be in the street. One of the very good things about Scott Ritter is he's not an academic. He's writing what he writes for a reason. He's active. He speaks. We all have to be active. Visit your congressman, unseat your congressman, run against them. There are various things that people try and do, and I guess there are different legal loopholes where people withhold their taxes for conscientious reasons. I think we have to change the whole policy, and we really should settle for nothing less. And in the United States, we are supposed to do that through the ballot box, and we should. There are issues with that, which I've addressed, as people know, but that just means you have to get active and you have to do it, and you have to look for candidates or become a candidate that's going to have the policy that's needed.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Elizabeth Fletcher. She's the founder of Unity News. Elizabeth. I think she's...
Hello. Sorry about that.
No problem.
All the times that I laugh at people staying muted, and I've done it myself. My question is, with the treaties lapsing, is any other country already starting negotiations? I heard the gentleman before mention that Russia were ready to start negotiations, but do you know of any other country that still have a diplomatic service, I guess?
Before you go, let me update you. Apparently, the negotiations have fallen through already. We have the Trump comments on extending New START treaty. Rather than extend New START, we should have our nuclear experts work on new, improved, and modernized treaty that can last long into the future, Trump wrote on Truth Social, claiming the agreement was being grossly violated. So there you have it. That what little discussion we had has collapsed. Diane.
Thank you, Garland.
Good. I actually would like to throw this to Scott, since Scott is one of the nuclear experts that Trump actually should be consulting on this matter. So, Scott, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I just want to remind everybody that China published a white paper on their arms control posture last fall, in which they made it clear that they're not interested in a three-way discussion about arms control. So, Donald Trump, of course, in April is going to China. He expects to meet with Xi Jinping and talk about this, but the Chinese are not receptive to this. What the Chinese have said in their paper and continue to articulate is that it's important that the nations with the largest nuclear arsenals get their respective acts together. That it's important for Russia and the United States to stabilize their nuclear programs, and then and only then will China be willing to come to the table. But otherwise, China is not going to come and be the weak sister in a in a trilateral agreement. Likewise, Russia has not indicated any desire to compel China to participate in something China doesn't want to participate in. And lastly, I just had some communication with some people in Russia who are influential on this issue, and they say that the feeling at the highest levels in Russia is that Donald Trump has betrayed the trust of Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin extended a hand, and Donald Trump has slapped it away. This is not a good way to begin negotiations. I don't know what Donald Trump thinks he's going to accomplish, but if I were in Vegas and putting money on what he wants to do, I'd be betting against him. Not because I don't want arms control, of course I do, but the methodologies and the approach. I mean, I don't want to get down into the weeds, but yes, New START was negotiated in bad faith, not by the Russians, but by the Americans. The violations of New START are unilaterally American violations, not Russian violations. So, maybe Donald Trump is saying without saying that he is going to change the approach, but it was Donald Trump that withdrew from the JCPOA, Donald Trump that withdrew from the INF Treaty, and now it's Donald Trump that allowed New START to lapse. I don't think there's any trust and confidence anywhere in the world that Donald Trump's the man to go to negotiate such a difficult, treaty as a new arms control agreement. We'll see. We're in a very dangerous situation. Again, we need new leadership. Diane, over to you.
Thanks. I'll just say that this indicates my second point. We need an entirely new strategic architecture. And I am sorry to stress this, but I have to. You have to understand that with the release of the Epstein files, it is obvious to the entire world, not just the American people, that the entirety of the political elite on both sides seems to be swept up in this thing. We supported a genocide in Gaza. We say we can kidnap any head of state that we want. We have a bunch of perverts who never seem to be held accountable. And then we run around the world acting like everybody should trust our government. That has to change. And the American people have to demand that it changes. And borrowing from General Douglas MacArthur, a spiritual recrudescence, in a sense, almost an atonement. When is the United States going to do something good for mankind and also good for the American people? Because I will say, and I talk to a lot of people as a candidate, an organizer, having run for office a number of times, the American people are suffering as a result of these policies. We are not benefiting from a nuclear arms race. The majority of the American people do not hold stock in Lockheed Martin like Richie Torres does, or others who are interested or voting for supporting these wars and these war crimes. And therefore, we have to change. But I would also say to the American people, the world has moved on. The majority of the people in the world do not think like the people who pretend that they are leaders in the United States and Western Europe. They are not lunatics like Kaja Kallas, Ursula von der Leyen, Trump, Lindsey Graham, Stephen Miller. These people are aberrations. They're abnormal. They belong in a psychiatric ward. Years ago, we would have recognized that, but we've become accustomed, as I said, particularly since the assassination of President Kennedy and the deliberate cultural assault on our nation with the post-industrial economy, where instead of thinking of what we will produce for others, we are consumers who only think about what we can get for ourselves, which is a very miserable way to live. This all has to change. And I believe, call me a wild, wide-eyed optimist, I believe that mankind is capable of changing in an instant if there is a vision and they see a pathway for how to get to that. Sometimes people may have to be scared, terrified to turn their brains back on, but you also have to present people with an idea of how to solve these things. And again, that's the purpose of this campaign.
All right, we currently have 3 people in the queue. We're going to go next to Rafid Al-Jabari of Integrity PAC. Rafid, you're up.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Two questions, if you don't mind me, to Diane, and the second part about the first part about the UN. Either one of you, Diane or Mr. Scott Ritter, may answer it. Given that the recent events in Gaza and even before then, since 2001 and 2003, and the invasion to Iraq and what happened in Gaza, the UN and Security Council has not had any real effect, and even before then. Don't you agree that it is time probably to make sure that this institution function for what it's founded for, and without influence from the major donor countries? And it's time also to mitigate or even repeal altogether the vote power, the veto power, I'm sorry. The veto power, given the abuse that happened in using that power by the United States and other Western countries to enforce international law and have it apply to everybody, no matter how little or how much you contribute to the UN, and also maybe changing the location of the UN headquarters in a neutral country that don't have not known to be having influence or lobby that drive the political power. The second part is about the economy. Given that basically also the downtrend in the economy and the dollar, the value of the dollar. My first question is, would you support using basically metrics that's tangible and factual to measure how well the economy is doing, rather than have it measured by how well Wall Street is doing? That's one. And back in the currency with precious metal, do you think that is feasible or more effective to do at this point? If yes, why? And if no, why? Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I'll start with the economy first. Wall Street definitely should not be the metric of the health of our economy. And I think that actually the measure of our economy should be in human terms, because after all, that's why we have an economy. That's why we had a national bank and a treasury under Alexander Hamilton's able direction. And the metric, therefore, of the success of your economy is in human factors: life expectancy, infant mortality, literacy, health. These are how you measure the health of your economy. Now, in terms of stabilizing currencies, Lyndon LaRouche years ago had called for a conference of the US, Russia, China, India. Putin, when he talked about a new security architecture, talked about first the UN Security Council. This was a few years ago, which is a slightly different combination of nations. India is not on that. But there needs to be a meeting of the major economic powers to admit that this bubble of derivatives obligations, which is now estimated to be at $2.4 quadrillion, simply cannot be paid. We have to, in effect, wipe it out. We have to do on a world version what FDR did during the bank reorganization, where you go through the banks and you write off the garbage. They're literally now selling derivatives on how long Donald Trump is going to speak at a press conference. That is not, why does that generate money for some billionaire? Forget it, wipe it out. If a few billionaires are only millionaires or multimillionaires, they will survive. But your town will not survive if the sewage system goes bankrupt, or you can't pay the police or the fire department or something like that. Therefore, we have to actually get rid of a lot of the garbage. We need fixed exchange rates among nations. And yes, the currencies should be pegged to something real, perhaps gold again, but a physical standard so that nations can actually make long-term plans. Because if you're going to develop major infrastructure, that's not, and it's built, it might be a 10-year or 25-year process. And it would be good to know, if you're borrowing money, that your currency is going to be worth the same amount during the time you're repaying the loan as it was when you borrowed it. So we would also take out that margin of speculation where now most of the so-called money that changes hands, and it doesn't really change hands because it's all online and virtual, but most of the money exchange is tied to speculation and not physical goods and physical trade. So we have to put that reality back in place. And that's why I said we really need an entirely new architecture. On the UN question, I'm glad you brought up relocating it. I was thinking maybe South Africa would be a good place. Really stick it to these guys. Or Palestine, why not? Once we secure that and create a stable nation. I have heard, I think it was from the Russian permanent representative or deputy permanent representative, that diplomats are actually threatened in New York, that they get calls saying, we know where your kid goes to school, you have to vote this way. So it seems clearly to be impracticable to have this organization deliberating on the world to be based in a place where the diplomats cannot be protected from, again, Roy Cohn style, real estate blackmail and threat practices. And I do think there are people who've done a lot more than I have on various ideas about how to reorganize the Security Council and the voting and things like that. So I would be interested in seeing their proposals. Scott may have more on that.
I'm somebody who believes that the United Nations needs to continue to exist. I believe the United Nations should be updated to reflect current realities, that we're trapped in a legacy system inherited from the end of the Second World War. And then I think we'll leave it up to the politicians to sort that out.
Next question we got is from Celeste Sayens, the Secretary General of the Mexican Journalists Club. What more should we in the Global South do to join the efforts to achieve a lasting peace? As the director of the Mexican Journalists Club, I have the responsibility to ensure that voices of thinkers such as yourself, Helga Zepp, LaRouche, and Scott Ritter are heard. What more should we be doing? So our question, what more should we in the Global South do to join the efforts to achieve a lasting peace? Diane Sare.
Well, you're doing, as you already said, quite a bit already. And I think you did various things to help in the case of Assange and so on. I think putting a spotlight, it would be nice for the world to know that not everybody in the United States is completely off their rocker. So covering what people like myself and Scott and others are saying, I think is very important. I think Mexico, actually, the leadership of Mexico over the years has had a number of very reasonable things to say, not perfect, but has been a useful voice of reality at times. So I think we just have to keep promoting that. And also, I think all of the media should do more to cover what China has done. China was not in great shape not very long ago, okay? It was not in great shape during the Cultural Revolution. It was pretty miserable. It was horribly impoverished. Even if you talk to young people in China, they will tell you that they can remember when they lived in a hut somewhere or didn't have running water. The pace of the development has been amazing. And I say that because where they came from was actually worse in terms of the poverty and the misery than we are experiencing in the United States today. But if you travel to China today, you will see they are far more advanced in terms of also the happiness of their population, the standard of living, the modern transportation. and what they are sharing with the rest of the world. And I think, frankly, most people don't think about it this way, and they're deprived of a certain optimism or a certain idea that actually the conditions in which we find ourselves could be very easily changed if we were to set our mind to it and organize with a future goal in mind.
Thank you. Next, we have Kelly Lane. Kelly Lane, you're up next. Unmute. She has to make sure you're unmuted, Kelly. Kelly Lane. Oh, there you go.
Okay. Hi, thank you so much, Diane. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the fact that I think, the U.S. continues to just avoid answering questions about Israel's nuclear arsenal. And so many Americans are still in the dark about, and maybe we all are, about what they actually have. And so that double standard, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about like the history of that.
Thank you. I'll let Scott say a little bit more about the history, but I know that President Kennedy was one person who thought they should be public, that they should not be developing nuclear weapons. And I think it's one of these glaring double standards, right? We say we have to obliterate Iran, which keeps saying they are not developing nuclear weapons. And in fact, the evidence indicates they were complying with all of the inspections. They were not developing nuclear weapons. They did not, last we inspected, have one. Israel does. So this is pretty outrageous. And the idea that they can just get away with that program and no one ever talks about it and people act like it's a secret is outrageous. It's almost as outrageous as Stephen Miller saying, well, the reason we're going to run Venezuela for the next period is because we can. It has no relationship to principles of reality. I don't think their arsenal is huge. I think they have, it is a great danger, because if you want to say what nations would be likely to use their nuclear weapons, I would not say Bibi Netanyahu is the most stable or moral of characters. And I don't really know what would happen if we are so foolhardy as to launch another war with Iran, in which Iran has no reason at this point to hold back, and what the consequences of that would be, and what is the risk to the region of Israel's nuclear arsenal. So I'll leave it there and let Scott respond with more of the details.
Well, thanks, Dan. Look, the history of Israel's nuclear program is one of inherent contradictions and one of the betrayal of the United States of principles. Before we had New START and START and INF and ABM, there was the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that was an agreement between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states, that the non-nuclear weapon states wouldn't be allowed to get nuclear weapons, and the nuclear weapon states would work to get rid of their nuclear weapons. New START Treaty represents an absolute failure of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, because now it appears that the United States and maybe Russia will continue to enlarge their nuclear arsenals. I think there's a talk about a 6-month extension, but I can guarantee during that 6-month extension, the United States will be preparing to upload, warheads that are currently in reserve. That means that we're talking about the end of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and maybe that's the best thing that we can do, because frankly speaking, I don't think we should spend much time talking about Israel at this point in time. Israel can't destroy the world. Russia can. The United States can. We don't have arms control. And you want to talk about imposing arms control on Israel at a time when we don't even have arms control ourselves. I think we need to get down to first principles, and first principles are the United States needs a consistent non-proliferation policy that it can then apply to all nations, including Israel. And we also need an arms control architecture that adheres to the principles of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. But today we're talking about the end of New START. Israel's not the right conversation at this point in time. That's just my opinion.
Next, we have Helmut Koss. Helmut, you're up next. Make sure you unmute.
Very good. Thank you. Yes. Moment. I have problems to get it. This is wonderful action today. I think the politicians are, as Jeffrey Sachs says, are so terrible that you should have a very good chance. You will have a very good chance, I think, because you are good, because of your character. Charter of the United Nations is the way to go. And the 1990, the Paris Agreement was good. What can we do to bring the world to its senses? If we see you becoming president, we would have a real chance. I think we should really try to get you a president. For president, this would be now a real human being is good. And I think this would be a very good thing. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Helmut. All right, and next we have Kynan Thistlethwaite. Make sure you unmute, Kynan. There we go.
Thanks. Thank you so much for this very important press conference. I wanted to because on the issue of the New START and the ending of all arms control treaties, I mean, people born after the fall of the Berlin Wall will really have little to no historical context for appreciating the true danger of thermonuclear war. And of course, what's also emerging and what people are getting distracted by in a different way is the Epstein affair. But the Epstein travesty, it also reveals the collapse of the transatlantic leadership structure and the relationship that exists between American and other intelligence agencies, and most notably British. So, of course, after September 11th, there were political agendas which sabotage efforts to alert the American people to this danger. People like Colleen Rowley, who Diane has spoken to, members of Congress, and surveillance system operators like Bill Binney. And we know the results of that. Thousands of Americans were killed. The Patriot Act was imposed, and we had a war under false pretext that was conducted against Iraq. So my question is, knowing what we now know from only half of the documents that were released from the Epstein archive, and knowing what we know about 9/11 and the security failures then, no one under the age of 35, I think, is going to trust anyone in this present leadership structure. And war is an issue for everyone in the world. So how do we establish a new leadership that people can trust? And that's directed to Diane and Scott.
Diane?
Yes, sorry. Well, as I said before, work with me. We need a movement, particularly of young people, to change the policy. This presidential campaign is not about some great thing that I'm going to do in January of 2029, although I assure you, if I'm in the White House, I'm going to do some amazing things. We have to actually get there. And at the moment, that's a question. The United States has destroyed all basis for trust. Another retired military person who I speak with rather frequently, when asked about the discussion of the New START that we just heard just happened a day after it expired, said this is amateur hour. Why the heck? This is supposed to be grown-up leaders of nuclear superpowers, and the American president decides that he can just blow off a serious proposal from the Russian president and then say, well, maybe we'll extend it, but we're not going to sign anything. And I think perhaps the first step for us surviving, and the reason I've been bringing up the Epstein case, is you have to face where we are. You cannot win a war. Scott can correct me if I'm wrong. I have not been in a physical war, thank God, and I don't intend to if I can help it. But if you're in a war, it is helpful to know what the terrain is. It's helpful to know who is your enemy and where they are and what their capabilities are and what your situation is. If you don't know what the disposition of your forces is, you're not gonna be able to win that war. If we don't face where our nation actually is right now, which we got in full lurid detail in these files, and then if you look around and you see that 17 people have now frozen to death on the streets of New York City, and 4.2 million young Americans are going to experience homelessness this year, and that we shut down over 90% of our inpatient psychiatric bed capacity over the last 60 years or so. I'm afraid not because we became so much more sane, but for other reasons. If you don't face that, if you don't actually look at where you are not going to be able to survive, to get to the other side. So I think first is admitting that. I think young people, in a sense, have a much better idea about that because young people are not delusional in terms of the future. If you're young, you know that you can't afford to buy a house. You can't afford to go to school. You know what it looks like trying to get to school. Many young people in the United States today, too many, have been witness or involved in schools where there were mass shootings. So you have a sort of an idea of where we are, but you're lacking an idea, not having ever lived in a productive economy, not ever lived in an economy where one parent working 40 hours a week could support a household. And I think that's part of, thinking about where our nation should be and could be. And that's why I said at the beginning, the fact that we finally, after all these years, will be sending astronauts to orbit the moon once again. Perhaps this could help ignite a certain kind of optimism and commitment to progress, but belief actually in the goodness and potential of mankind, which I think is the biggest lack that we see right now among our political leadership.
We have one more question, and we're going to go to closing remarks. It is from Kevin Pearl. Are the threats against Iran actually aimed at destroying the nuclear proliferation treaty? Scott, if you could answer that, if you could comment on it at least.
I think it's far more complicated than that. But again, I just want to redirect people to the purpose of today's conference. And the reason why I'm here is the expiration of New START treaty. And I think one of the reasons why New START has expired is that people have been focused on New START and arms control and get to, if you're like a cat who gets distracted by laser beams, you're never going to get focused on anything. So I'm going to be focused on New START and focused on getting arms control back up and running.
Thank you, Scott. As was it Steve Covey that said, always keep the main thing the main thing? Diane, you get the last word.
Okay. Well, thank you. I would like to thank people who are here. I would ask you to actually cover this. Those of you with the press, cover what has been said here. I think this is a terrible day. It should be embarrassing as Americans that our leadership would simply ignore something as serious as this, the expiration of the last treaty, and the other things are in a shambles as a result on this non-proliferation treaty and everything else. We cannot continue this way. It has to change. And I would reiterate what I said, which is one, there has to be a declaration of no first use of nuclear weapons. I don't think people would necessarily believe the United States, but we should say it. Right now, we're not even saying it. We say whenever we feel like it, or what, it's deliberately vague, which makes things very dangerous. Two, that the entire system in which we are having these discussions is outmoded. We have to recognize that the transatlantic financial system of relations among nations is completely defunct, obsolete, doesn't work. And I'm not saying the UN doesn't work. I concur with Scott. In case that wasn't clear, we need the United Nations. The Board of Peace should not be allowed, and no one should even consider that as a replacement. I think is probably designed to undermine it. We need the United Nations. It needs to reflect better the configuration of the world today. And then finally, the question of projects that we can embark on with Russia for mutual benefit for the people of Russia and the people of the United States, the Bering Strait Tunnel and Strategic Defense of Earth. Both of these not only would benefit the people of Russia and the United States, I will add, but will benefit the human race as a whole. And I think when it comes down to it, that's actually what Americans want. We want our nation to be good. In our little short slice of time that we're here on Earth, we would like to do something that makes the world a better place and makes life better for future generations. And that is what everyone should dedicate themselves to doing.
Thank you very much. We want to thank everyone for joining us today and for the wonderful questions. And as per this discussion, number one, well, let's remember that Scott told what Scott said and his laser focus on addressing the New START treaty and to pushing the politicians in charge right now to get this new treaty completed and signed as soon as possible. And number two, and this is very important, we need to focus on helping Diane Sare in her quest to attain the presidency in 2028 so that we can ensure that future generations are able to advance and that we can go beyond the START treaty and move towards eventually maybe hopefully no nuclear weapons, and that we can have a peaceful nature to our existence so that there's not a need for such violent weapons. Thank you very much, Diane Sare. Diane, where's your website for those who don't know?
Thank you. My website is sareforpresident.com, and it's all written out, SAREFOR president.com.
Thank you very much. And for those who don't know, Scott Ritter's got excellent books. If you want to learn more about some of these treaties and about the history and about some of the plans that he has as Diane's advisor on this particular issue, go to scottritter.com for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Scott.